Imagine for a second that you're 17 years old and you're staying the night at your best friend's house. Let's call him Paul. Paul lives in a house that's been standing for over a century, tucked away in one of those quiet, woodsy suburbs where the trees are so thick they seem to swallow the streetlights at night. It's the kind of house that has character, creaky floorboards, high ceilings, and a basement that feels a few degrees colder than the rest of the world. You're in Paul's room, lying in a sleeping bag on the floor. Paul is out cold in his bed, just a few feet to your right. It's that dead hour of the morning, maybe 4 or 5 a.m., when the world is completely still. Suddenly, you're wide awake. You didn't hear a bang or a crash. You just felt something. And then a voice, clear as day. And so close you can feel the phantom brush of breath against your skin, whispers directly into your left ear. It says your name and then follows it with 4 words that change the air in the room. You need to leave now. It isn't a scream. It isn't malicious. It's a warning. Your heart hammers against your ribs. Your first thought is that Paul is messing with you. He's a prankster. He does this kind of thing. You spin around to your right to catch him in the act, but Paul hasn't moved. He's deep in sleep, his breathing heavy and rhythmic, and that's when the logic hits you like a physical weight. You heard the whisper in your left ear, but Paul was on your right. Between your left ear and the wall, there was nothing but 3 feet of empty, cold air. This wasn't just a one-off event. It was the beginning of a realization that for Paul and his family, this wasn't just a house. It was a witness to something they couldn't explain. For years, Paul had tried to tell his friends about what happened in that room, but most of them, including you at first, thought he was full of it. They called it an overactive imagination or the side effects of living in a spooky old neighborhood. But the house had a way of making sure everyone who walked through its doors eventually understood the truth. Paul's own experiences in that bedroom were much darker than a simple whisper. For a long time, he suffered from a relentless, terrifying cycle of sleep paralysis. He would wake up in the middle of the night, his mind screaming to move, but his body wouldn't obey. He'd be pinned to the mattress, staring into the darkness of his room. Very frequently, his brain would play a horrific trick on him. He had a standing fan by his bed to keep the air moving, but in the grip of the paralysis, that fan would twist and distort. It would morph into the figure of a demon girl standing right over him. The terror was so visceral that as soon as the paralysis broke, Paul would lunge out of bed with a jolt of pure adrenaline, punching or throwing the fan to the ground before he even realized where he was. And she wasn't alone. Paul would often see someone or something standing in the closet that his bed faced. Sometimes he'd see it while he was locked in paralysis, but other times he'd see the shadow while he was wide awake, just catching a glimpse of a figure retreating into the clothes. The strangest part, the day Paul finally moved out of that house, the sleep paralysis stopped. Just like that. It didn't follow him. It belonged to the room, but the activity wasn't confined to Paul's 4 walls. The entire second floor had a weight to it. One of Paul's sisters used to talk about a little boy she'd see in the bathroom, just a small, pale figure that would disappear as soon as you looked twice. You could dismiss that as a kid's story until the adults started seeing him too. Paul's mother once opened her bedroom closet to find the same little boy standing there, tucked behind the hanging coats. He didn't try to scare her. He just looked up at her with a lost expression and asked, "Where's my mom?" Hearing that from an adult, someone who doesn't have a reason to make things up, changes the way you look at a house. It's no longer a haunted story. It's a tragedy that hasn't finished playing out. Even the skeptics in the group weren't safe. There was a mutual friend who came over once a year to take care of the family's 2 dogs while they were on vacation. One evening, the house was dark and empty. She was in the kitchen just finishing up feeding the dogs. To her left was the dining room, which led to the entryway and a small, quiet living room. Everything was peaceful until a sound tore through the silence, a blood-curdling, jagged shriek coming from that living room. It sounded like someone was being murdered right there in the house with her. She didn't check for intruders. She didn't call out. She grabbed the dogs, bolted out the front door, and refused to go back in. When she finally got Paul on the phone and told him, gasping for breath, that someone was in his house screaming, Paul just laughed. "Yeah," he told her, "shit like that happens sometimes." A few years later, the biggest doubt doubter of them all, the guy who thought the entire friend group was just feeding into each other's delusions, had his turn. Paul was hosting a party, and as usual, everyone was hanging out in the basement to keep the noise away from the neighbors. This friend, who was completely sober, headed upstairs to the dining room to grab another beer. The ground floor was empty. The lights were low. There was a long porch that stretched across the back of the house, visible through the dining room windows. As he reached for a drink, he looked out at the porch and froze. Standing there, staring directly through the glass at him, was a tall, grim-looking woman. She didn't look like a person you'd see in the neighborhood. She was featureless, almost like a silhouette that had been cut out of the night itself. There was no movement, no expression. He looked away for a split second, his brain trying to process what he was seeing, and when he looked back, the porch was empty. There was nowhere she could have gone that fast. A few days later, when he sheepishly told Paul what he'd seen, Paul just nodded. He and his siblings had seen that same woman before. That was the day the doubter became a believer. The basement where those parties happened was a maze of old boxes and forgotten furniture, a storage cellar that had accumulated a century's worth of stuff. One summer, Paul's family decided to have what they called the Throw Old Shit Away Fest. They invited everyone over to help clear out the clutter. That was the day Paul's dad revealed the secret room. In the far, dark corner of the basement, hidden behind a literal wall of junk, was a small storage closet that almost no one knew existed. When they finally cleared the path and opened the door, they found a collection of vintage items that felt like they belonged in a museum or a horror movie. Among the relics was an old-fashioned music box, the kind with a delicate dancing ballerina on top, reminiscent of something out of The Conjuring. It was beautiful, but it felt wrong. It was covered in a thick layer of dust. The spring felt tight, and the air around it was stagnant. They decided it was too creepy to mess with and left it right there in that secret closet, shutting the door on it. A few days later, Paul and another friend were back in the basement, continuing the cleanup. They were on the opposite side of the room, nowhere near the secret closet. They hadn't touched the door all day. Suddenly, the silence was broken by a thin, mechanical melody. The music box, the one they had left unwound and shut away, had started to play. It was coming from behind the closed door of the closet. The notes were slow, deliberate, echoing through the empty basement. They didn't stay to see if the ballerina was spinning. They ran up those stairs and didn't go back down for the rest of the afternoon. But the most intense, most violent event didn't happen in the basement or the kitchen. It happened at the very top of the house. Paul's older sister had one of the small bedrooms in the attic area. One night, she fell into a dream that was more vivid than anything she'd ever experienced. In the dream, she was lying on her bed, and she was being exorcised. She could feel her body convulsing, the weight of invisible hands holding her down, and she could hear a group of priests standing over her, their voices rising in a rhythmic, aggressive chant of scripture. It felt crazy, intense, and terrifyingly real. At the absolute peak of the dream's intensity, she jolted herself awake, a scream tearing out of her throat. At that exact second, a heavy rosary that she kept hanging on her wall, a symbol of protection, flew off its hook. It didn't just fall, it was launched across the room. It hit the floor with such force that the beads shattered into 100 pieces, scattering across the hardwood. She was alone in the room. The air was dead still. There was no wind, no earthquake, nothing to explain why a religious icon would be thrown and destroyed at the very moment she woke up from a nightmare about a demon being cast out. Years have passed since Paul's family moved out of that house. The woodsy suburb is still there, and the house still stands, likely housing a new family who thinks they've just bought a charming piece of history. But the people who grew up there, the friends who stayed over, and even the skeptics who only visited once, carry those stories with them. They remember the feeling of being watched from the closet. They remember the shriek in the living room. And they remember the whisper that warned a 17-year-old boy to leave before the house showed him what else was hiding in the dark. Because in a house that's been standing for 100 years, the walls don't just have ears. Sometimes they have memories. And sometimes those memories don't want to be forgotten.